My mother rolled her eyes the moment I walked into that courtroom. And it wasn't subtle, it was the same theatrical role I'd seen my whole life. The kind designed to recruit witnesses and rewrite history before anyone speaks. She wanted the room to believe I was the problem. The disruption. The reason we were all standing there under bad fluorescent lights at 9 in the morning. But the first person whose reaction mattered didn't look at her at all. Judge Marcus Brennan glanced up from the file, saw my face, and stopped writing. Recognition settled in the space between us like a verdict delivered without words. And for a beat the old building seemed to hold its breath. I didn't nod. He didn't smile. We didn't need to. He had clerked for my grandfather, William Parker, long before I was old enough to understand what a gavel could do to a life. And I could read in his eyes that he remembered the house with the tulips and the Sunday dinners and the girl who never had parents show up but somehow always had family. That look didn't promise me anything. But it told me one thing clearly: this case would not be decided by performance. If you're listening to this for the first time, I'm Haley Morrison, 32, a prosecutor who grew up in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and flour and in a home where love was a verb, not a speech. My earliest memory isn't of Diane or Scott, the people who share my DNA and little else. It's of my grandmother Helen standing at the counter with a wooden spoon and telling me that the best cookies have extra love and extra chocolate while she let a 4-year-old pour too many chips into the bowl. She never scolded. She laughed. And when my grandfather came home still wearing his robe, he lifted me off the stool and demanded a full report of my day as if I were delivering closing arguments to a panel of justices. That was what it felt like to be raised by people who show up. No grand speeches, no apologies after long silences. Just a steady rhythm of presence, front row seats at school plays, loud cheers at muddy soccer games, careful notes after debate tournaments, the same chairs at the same table every Sunday night. Meanwhile, the people who called themselves my parents drifted through in expensive coats and with careful excuses. Diane perfected the art of kissing air and criticizing the softness of my upbringing as if compassion were a defect you could iron out. Scott usually stayed in the car and honked when he wanted her to leave. The habit of a man who liked to be adjacent to responsibility without ever touching it. Even when I was small, I understood the difference between an entrance and an arrival. One is noise. The other is presence. And presence was what I had. Childhood taught me about absence in ways no lecture could have. There is a photograph of me at 7 in a tinsel antler headband, standing on a school stage under harsh lights for a Christmas concert. And when I look at it now, I don't see the costume or the tremble of my hands on the paper. I see 2 empty chairs beside my grandparents. I had practiced for weeks and learned to sing a song I didn't much like because I wanted the moment where a child scans the crowd and catches her mother's eye and feels seen. Instead I caught the steady, patient weight of my grandfather's camcorder and the soft, certain smile of my grandmother holding flowers from her own yard. They never mentioned the empty chairs. And they never needed to. Because the lesson was already written. Some people arrive for you and some people arrive for themselves. On Sundays, my grandfather taught me chess without ever letting me win. And when I finally beat him years later with a line he hadn't expected, he called 3 people to announce that I had earned it. My grandmother planted patience into my hands with bulbs and soil and the quiet instruction that you cannot force life to bloom. You can only tend it and return to it until it decides to rise. They never criticized Diane or Scott to my face. Not once. They told me my parents were busy with important things and then modeled what important actually meant. When I was 12, the fiction broke on a winter night when Scott laughed on the porch and told my grandfather that writing a check counted as parenting. And my grandfather's voice went flat and dangerous in the way only judges and surgeons manage. He told Scott that one day the girl inside that house would be grown and she would remember who showed up. He was right. And I do. I left for college with a scholarship and a spine shaped by 2 people who believed rigor is a kind of love. Called home every Sunday. And built a life around the promise that I would use the law without letting it use me. Then the call came in the middle of an afternoon lecture. My grandmother had collapsed in her garden. The tulip bulbs still in their paper wrappers. I drove home through 6 hours of rain and arrived to find my grandfather sitting in the dark soil with those bulbs in his hands like he was guarding them from a storm only he could see. We didn't talk, we didn't need to. Grief has a way of rearranging a house without moving a single chair. And the rooms felt different from that night on. But if absence can be heavy, presence can be heavier in a way that holds rather than crushes. We carried each other. I paused school and then returned. Studied later and harder. Learned the discipline of showing up when you would rather numb yourself. And I watched my grandfather age with the kind of grace that looks like humility from the outside and like work from the inside. I graduated at the top of my class and he recorded every minute. Shaky hands and all. Diane and Scott sent a card with their names and no return address. I started in the prosecutor's office and discovered I was good at reading the shape of lies. And on Sunday nights I sat across from a man who had been reading them for 40 years and we ate grilled cheese or takeout and spoke about the difference between mercy and indulgence. The cost of power when it is wielded correctly. And the trap of believing that blood is an argument that can outweigh a life. I knew he would die. We all know these things in abstract. What I didn't know was how quiet a house gets when the person who taught you to think is no longer moving through its rooms. Or how ordinary the evidence of a life can look when it is waiting for hands that won't return. He died in his sleep at 87. And I stood in Margaret Chen's office a week later listening to the language of estates and instruments and beneficiaries in the same calm voice you hear when they call boarding groups at an airport. And it felt indecent that a life could be translated to paper so quickly. I expected something small and intimate. The watch I'd played with. A first edition he kept in a locked glass case. A note reminding me to keep my temper and sharpen my questions. Instead, the file was thick and the sums were large and the house with the tulips was mine. And when Margaret slid a sealed letter across the desk with my name on it in his handwriting and asked whether I wanted to read it there or at home, I put it in my bag and walked out because some things deserve 4 walls and a door. The letter said what he never needed to say out loud, that he had not left me everything because of blood but because of presence. That I had earned not the money but the trust. That my parents had made their choices and he was making his. That I owed them nothing and I owed the truth everything. I read it twice, and then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because it felt like a closing argument I had been writing my whole life and he had signed for me at the end. People think inheritance is a number. But the only thing that matters is what it reveals. A week later an unfamiliar number lit my phone and my mother's voice slid into the room without hello and asked what he had left me. And when I hung up on her I felt not anger but clarity. I went back to the house before the transfer was final and found the chessboard still mid-game and the bulbs my grandmother never planted. And I set them in the ground while the light went down and I told the dirt that I would take it from here. If you want to know what revenge looks like when it doesn't make noise. It looks like a woman who refuses to perform grief for people who didn't earn the right to see it. It looks like someone who understands that love is not a story you tell later. It is a record you keep over years. A list no one sees while you are making it. A pattern that refuses to be erased by sentiment when the paper finally goes on the table. Years after I learned what absence feels like from the inside of a school auditorium. I stood in a courthouse and watched my mother try to turn biology into an argument. And I knew before the first objection that she had brought a knife to a ledger. My grandfather was gone, but the evidence remained, and the law he taught me to respect had a simple question to answer: who showed up? Because years later, when he died in his sleep, he left behind more than memories. He left me a letter, and a house with tulips, and a record no one could fake. And $3 million that said the quiet part out loud. I didn't cry when I received the will. People expect emotion in those moments, shaking hands. Uncontrollable tears, collapsing into grief. But grief doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it goes silent. It sits inside you like cold steel. Steady and sharp. I sat in Margaret Chen's office, listening to her legal cadence as she detailed what my grandfather had left behind. And all I felt was an unsettling stillness. I had prepared myself for a watch. A book. Perhaps a letter. Something small. Something symbolic. Instead, I was handed an estate. The house. The accounts. The investments. The full weight of a life built through decades of discipline. $3 million on paper. And something far heavier, responsibility. Margaret slid the final envelope across her desk. My name on it. Haley. His handwriting. The same script he used on sticky notes left on the refrigerator. Milk. Court at 9. Remember integrity. My hands trembled, though my face did not. She asked if I wanted to read it there. I told her no. Some truths require solitude. It was late evening when I sat on my bed with that letter resting across my knees. The house around me was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on the bones. When I finally broke the seal, I heard him as if he were standing in the doorway. My dearest Haley, if you are reading this, I am gone, but what I leave you is not about blood. It is about presence. You showed up when others did not. You loved us when it cost you nothing, and when it cost you everything. Your parents made their choices. This is mine. Be strong. You owe them nothing. You owe the truth everything. Grandpa. I didn't cry. I read it again, and again, because I needed to absorb not the words, but the confirmation. He had seen, all those years, all those dinners, every silent loyalty. He saw it, and that was the inheritance. 3 days later, my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I answered out of habit, not expectation. What did he leave you? My mother. No greeting, no softness, straight to extraction. No mention of his death. No question of where he spent his final hours. Just the hunt for assets. I disconnected the call without a word. People misunderstand strength. They think it is confrontation. Sometimes it is refusal. I returned to my grandparents' house one last time before the transfer was final. The air still held traces of them, the faint scent of lavender from my grandmother's room. Coffee grounds in the kitchen. Chalk dust from my grandfather's study where he corrected legal drafts with relentless precision. I walked through each room. Not to remember, but to witness. Grief doesn't erase memory. It frames it. In the garden, weeds had begun to press through the soil. Tulip season had ended months ago, leaving only husks. I knelt, pulling away dry stems until my fingers brushed against something unexpected. Paper. A crumpled brown packet. Inside, tulip bulbs. Unplanted. The last ones she touched. She died before she could put them in the ground. I pressed them into the earth. Slowly, deliberately. I had no prayer to offer. No words. Just a vow. I'll take it from here. Days passed. The world believed the story had ended. It hadn't. A thick envelope arrived by courier. Legal documents, headed with 4 words. Morrison versus Morrison. My mother and father, plaintiffs. Me, the defendant. They were suing me for undue influence, claiming I had manipulated a grieving, elderly man into cutting them out of his will. 32 years of absence was now rebranded as victimhood. It was almost surgical, the precision with which they weaponized blood. I took the documents to Thomas Avery, an attorney I trusted because my grandfather had trusted him first. He read through the claims with a grim sobriety I recognized from courtrooms. Not shock, recognition. They're claiming diminished capacity, coercion, and emotional manipulation, he said. I almost smiled at the irony. They're going to paint you, he continued, as a schemer, someone who isolated him to secure inheritance. I never asked him for anything. I replied. I know, he said, but they're not after truth. They're after narrative. He leaned forward. Are you prepared to take the stand against your own blood? I met his eyes. I have been taking that stand my entire life. This is just the first time there will be a transcript. That night, I didn't rage. I didn't break dishes or scream into walls. I brewed tea, sat at the kitchen table, opened the letter again, not to mourn, to sharpen. Because this wasn't about inheritance. It was about legacy. And legacy isn't defended with grief. It is defended with evidence. The world likes to believe blood is an argument that outranks truth. But blood had 32 years to prove itself. 32 years to show up. In a courtroom, facts become spine. And I was ready to walk in with mine aligned. The day Diane and Scott filed that lawsuit was the day they made one fatal error. They mistook my silence for weakness. They believed absence could be rewritten as sacrifice. They thought performance could overpower pattern. They forgot who raised me. They forgot I was taught by a man who spent 40 years dismantling lies. They forgot I don't need rage. I have records. The next morning, I placed my grandfather's letter back in its envelope and stored it in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but out of discipline. There are things you carry in your pocket. And there are things you carry in your spine. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for a ruling. Because justice doesn't require volume. It requires presence. And I had shown up. They thought I would walk into that courtroom quietly, like someone who had something to hide. They forgot who raised me. I didn't enter as a daughter begging to be believed. I entered as a prosecutor who understands that a courtroom is not a place for emotion, it is a place for evidence. I arrived before my parents did. The corridors were still empty. The air not yet stirred by footsteps or arguments. Early morning light fell across the marble floor like a deliberate warning, choose your footing carefully. I had prosecuted embezzlers, fraud artists, perjurers, people who believed the law was an arena to outtalk the truth. I knew the type. That morning, I was facing the most familiar kind of adversary, those who hid behind blood. When Diane entered, she didn't look at me. She looked at the audience. Her lawyer, Richard Palmer, hovered beside her. Calm, confident, practiced in pity. She wore grief like costume fabric. Ready to perform. Scott followed, hands in his pockets, expression flat, as if this were a tedious inconvenience, not a lawsuit against his only child. Their eyes slid past me as if I were furniture. But then Judge Marcus Brennan took the bench. He scanned the room, saw me, and stopped. A quiet recognition. He had clerked for my grandfather decades ago. He had eaten at our table. He had seen my grandfather's mind at work. His certainty, his temperance, and now he would see mine. Case number was called Morrison versus Morrison. The irony was lost on no one. Palmer began with his opening. His voice was soft, trembling at practiced crescendos. He spun a story of a grieving daughter, a woman denied access to her own father by a calculated granddaughter seeking sole control of a frail old man. He invoked loneliness, longing, and final wishes that were distorted by manipulation. He never mentioned calendars. He never mentioned money. He never mentioned they had never tried to stay. Then Thomas stood. He didn't perform. He did not appeal to sentiment. He opened a single binder. This case, he said, is not about sorrow. It is about pattern. 32 years of absence by the plaintiffs. 32 years of presence by the defendant. That presence is documented, not in memory, but in records kept by the decedent himself. The evidence will show who cared for Judge Parker, and who required care from him. That is the only question this court must answer. He sat down. No flourish, just fact. Palmer called Diane first. She approached the witness stand as though approaching a grave. Her voice cracked at the right moments. She spoke of being pushed away by her father, of being painted as unworthy, of Haley turning him against her. She wept without tears, asked the courtroom how a father could abandon his own child. Thomas didn't challenge her narrative. Not at first. He waited until she stopped reaching for sympathy. Then he stood. Mrs. Morrison, he began, voice calm. On what date did you last spend Father's Day with your father? She hesitated. I don't recall exactly. Do you recall attending Haley's high school graduation? She blinked. I believe, yes, I think so. He placed a photograph on the evidence display. I stood in the frame with my grandparents. There was an empty space beside them. You were not present, he said. Did you attend her college graduation? Law school? Any Sunday dinner? She stared, silent. He laid down a second file. Bank statements. For over 2 decades, your father transferred $3,000 monthly into your accounts. Additional sums followed for your husband's failed businesses. Can you provide a single record, one, that indicates you supported him financially? She didn't answer. So, Thomas concluded, he provided presence and provision. You provided neither, yet you claim entitlement. She broke then, but the courtroom had already seen it, not grief. Exposure. Scott was worse, detached, irritated, insisting he had tried his best. Blaming travel, work, tension, anything but choice, until Thomas asked, quietly, Mr. Morrison, can you name a single birthday you attended? One sporting event? One ceremony? He could not. They had confused survival with innocence. They believed memory would defend them. They forgot the one thing my grandfather always preserved: documentation. But perhaps the most dangerous witness was the one Palmer believed would save his case, a psychiatrist named Dr. Raymond Hughes. A man who had never met my grandfather but had come prepared to declare him emotionally compromised and susceptible. His credentials were impeccable. His testimony was poised. Until Thomas asked one question. "Doctor, did you ever speak to Judge Parker?" "No." "Examine him?" "No." "Observe his behavior, his speech, his judgment?" "No." Thomas leaned in, unblinking. "So your testimony is not drawn from a diagnosis. It is drawn from assumption." Hughes faltered. The illusion of incapacity dissolved. Then came the witnesses who truly mattered. Justice Andrew Mitchell, who served beside my grandfather for years, testified. He was sharp to the end. Intentional, deliberate. Professor Langley, of Harvard Law, said, he discussed jurisprudence with me 1 month before his death. His intellect was not diminished. Margaret Chen, a state attorney, he brought me calendars, financial records. He predicted this lawsuit. And finally, Patricia Caldwell, my grandmother's friend. She didn't speak as a lawyer. She spoke as a neighbor. "He was lonely," she said gently, "but not lost. Eleanor died, and he missed her, but every Sunday, Haley came, and when she left, he would say, 'She's the reason I still set the table for 2. He wasn't manipulated. He was kept alive. It was then I felt it shift, not the case, but the air. Biology was losing its voice. They had spoken of blood. We had spoken of presence. I hadn't taken the stand yet. But I would. And when I did, I would not defend myself. I would testify. Not for me. For the man who taught me that truth never trembles." They called me to the stand after the last witness stepped down. Not because they were ready to hear the truth, but because everything else they had tried had failed. I stood, not as the accused, and not even as a daughter, but as someone who had spent an entire lifetime preparing for silence to be mistaken for surrender. My steps were quiet, my posture still. I took the oath. I sat, and I looked directly at the judge, not at Diane, not at Scott, and certainly not at the spectators waiting to feed on spectacle. I was not there to perform. I was there to clarify history. "Miss Morrison," Judge Brennan said, his voice steady, "you may proceed." I nodded once, and I began. "I was born when my mother was 18. 3 months later, I was brought to my grandparents' house. What was meant to be temporary became permanent. No emotion, just fact. My grandparents raised me. They were present for every school play, every soccer game, every debate. They taught me to read, to write, to keep my word. My parents visited, occasionally, twice a year, sometimes. I didn't look at Diane. I looked straight ahead, letting the room feel the emptiness between what was said and what had been done. When my grandmother died, I returned home from law school. I stayed. I cooked. I cleaned the garden she didn't finish. My parents came to the funeral. They left before the reception. There was no tremor in my voice because I was not wounded. I was recorded. They claim undue influence. They claim manipulation. They claim grief made him vulnerable. But grief does not create love. Love creates presence. And presence, I said, cannot be faked. A stillness swept the benches. I continued. He taught me the law. Not in words. In observation. He taught me that responsibility is not claimed, it is demonstrated. I never asked him for anything. I never discussed inheritance. I never even knew what he possessed financially. I only knew what he gave me in discipline. Then I turned, just slightly, toward Diane. They say I isolated him. I did not isolate him. They abandoned him. I let that rest in the air, calm and surgical. Palmer stood. His moment. He approached with careful pacing. His voice drenched in sorrow he did not feel. "Miss Morrison," he began, "is it possible that, despite your devotion, you resented your mother? That perhaps you influenced your grandfather against her, not out of duty, but out of pain?" I met his eyes. I did not need to influence him. My mother did that herself. With her absence. He tried again. You benefited financially from living with him. Did you not? Tuition, housing, mentorship? Yes, I said, because I was his granddaughter. The same way he provided over $800,000 to my mother. But the difference is simple. I didn't take in exchange for distance. I gave in exchange for nothing. His jaw tensed, strategy fracturing. So you deny, he pressed, that you stood to gain? I leaned forward, voice even. If wealth had been my motive, I would have sought it elsewhere. Do you know how much a prosecutor makes? Less than a private attorney. Less than what I could earn if I chased corporations instead of convictions. But every Sunday, I chose to eat grilled cheese with an aging man because I loved him. Not because I needed him. And if you cannot understand that, then you have never understood loyalty. The courtroom fell silent. No further questions, he muttered. I stepped down without looking back. That evening, in the hallway outside, people watched me as if waiting for collapse. But I did not collapse. I simply exhaled. Everything I had said was true. And truth does not require healing. The next day, Palmer delivered his closing. He spoke of blood, heritage, rights by birth. He said the words daughter and forgiveness as if they were legal claims. He asked for restoration, not of money, but of title. He asked the court to honor biology. Then Thomas stood, and with a single sentence, erased the illusion. Your Honor, he said, blood is an argument, but presence is evidence. He methodically recited time-stamped visits, call logs, calendar notes. He walked through letters written by a father tired of funding indifference. He cited bank transfers, unreturned, unacknowledged. He highlighted Sunday dinners, hospital nights, courtroom attendance. And finally, he closed the binder. This is not a case about inheritance. It is a case about who remained. Judge Parker did not leave his estate to the loudest. He left it to the last. He sat. I didn't need to hear the verdict to know it had already landed. But I remained. I wanted to watch biology be cross-examined by truth. When the gavel fell, it didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like correction, sharp, final, unarguable. Judge Brennan returned to the bench with the ruling in his hands. And although he kept his face composed, there was a weight in the air that made the entire courtroom still. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Diane or Scott. He addressed the record, the only witness that never lies. This case, he began, has been presented as a dispute over inheritance. It is not. It is a dispute over history. He spoke without haste. To establish undue influence, one must prove coercion, manipulation, or incapacity. The plaintiffs have proven none. Instead, the evidence shows a decedent who documented his intentions, who recorded visits, payments, broken commitments, a man fully aware of the consequences of his decisions. He turned a page. Conversely, the defendant's presence is recorded through action, not statement. There is no evidence of isolation, only evidence of consistency. Then came the sentence that ended their performance. The will stands as written. The petition is denied. Diane let out a sharp breath, part disbelief, part realization. Scott shifted in his seat, jaw tight, the first sign that he understood they had not merely lost money. They had lost narrative. But the judgment wasn't finished. Furthermore, Judge Brennan continued, this court finds the plaintiffs filed this action without substantial merit, resulting in unnecessary burden upon the defendant. Costs and attorney's fees are awarded to the defendant. And with that, he brought the gavel down. It echoed, not loudly, cleanly. I rose, not out of celebration, but to leave what no longer belonged to me. As I gathered my papers, there was no victory in me, only confirmation. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud. This was justice, and justice doesn't raise its voice. But in the hallway, where the marble makes every sound feel colder, she stopped me. Haley, Diane whispered. I turned. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Her mascara had bled beneath her eyes. Her hands trembled, and for the first time, she looked at me as though she saw someone she could no longer name. I'm still your mother, she said. I studied her, carefully, calmly. No, I replied. You're the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Helen. She flinched. I didn't. I waited for you. I continued. Birthdays, graduations, hospital rooms, Sunday nights. You never came. You had 32 years to be my mother. You chose not to. And now that there is nothing left to take, you remember me. That is not love. That is scarcity. She reached for my arm. I stepped away. Do not call me again. I said. Do not come to my home. I do not hate you. You are simply nothing to me now. She broke then. Truly broke. But I didn't stay to witness it. I didn't leave in fury. I left in completion. That evening, when the courthouse doors had closed behind the last echo of accusations, I didn't uncork champagne or rehearse speeches of vindication. I went to the cemetery. Quietly, as I always had. The air was cool, the grounds empty. The tulips, hers, were beginning to press through the soil again. Green blades splitting earth. I knelt between their graves and placed my hand flat against the stone. We won, I whispered, not in court, in record. I sat with them until the light changed. I didn't speak again. I didn't need to. They always heard what I didn't say. The world believed everything ended with the verdict. They were wrong. Legal battles end in rulings. Family battles end in recognition. And mine had only just reached that point. Because when silence is finally heard, something else must follow. Legacy. I returned to work the next morning. My desk was stacked with files, fraud, assault, perjury, lives entangled in lies. I logged into my system. I reviewed affidavits. I went back to prosecuting people who mistake deception for strategy. A colleague passed by my office door. Paused. Rough few weeks? He asked quietly. No, I said. It wasn't rough. It was recorded. People think that victories feel like fire. They don't. They feel like marble. Cold. Certain. Unmoving. Because justice isn't passion. It's architecture. And I had just laid my first cornerstone. I believed it was over. The gavel had fallen, the verdict delivered, and the world had categorized the case as closed. But endings rarely arrive with ceremony. They arrive at your doorstep, quiet, unannounced, holding things you didn't know were waiting. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door and found Patricia Caldwell, my grandparents' neighbor. The woman who used to bring casseroles when illness came. Who tended her roses alongside my grandmother's tulips. But this time, she wasn't carrying food or condolences. She was holding a worn, heavy envelope. He wanted her to have them, she said quietly, but he never sent them. I didn't know if it was my place. After the trial, I decided it was. She pressed the envelope into my hands. My grandfather's handwriting, one word on the front. Diane. She walked away. No explanation, no comfort. I stood there for a moment. The weight of unwritten goodbyes resting against my palm. I didn't open it immediately. It took hours before I sat at my table. The sunlight slanting across the wood. The house too silent for what I was about to read. Inside were letters, dozens, some yellowed, some recent, all addressed to my mother. I opened the first. Dear Diane. I'm writing because speaking allows too much anger. Haley had her dance recital today. She was looking for you. She did not say your name. But I saw it on her face. Children don't know how to disguise expectation. This is the third event you've missed this year. I moved to the next. You called for money again. You mentioned rent, then groceries, then emotional exhaustion. You did not mention your daughter. I will send what I can. But understand, support is not the same as presence. Another. Your mother died today. You attended the funeral. Thank you for that. You didn't stay. You left before I could ask why. She wanted to see you more. I wish you had let her. The handwriting shifted, older now, edged with tremor. Diane, I have given you $600. I told myself I was helping. I see now I was enabling. You were not failing because you lack resources. You were failing because you refuse responsibility. And then, the one I would never forget. The greatest gift I ever gave you was Haley. You abandoned her, but she saved me. I wish you could have seen what I saw. I wish you had stayed long enough to try. I don't know how long I sat there. There were no tears, only the stillness that comes when truth is no longer private. My grandfather had seen her. Fully. He had carried disappointment without letting it sour his discipline. He loved a daughter who refused to love herself. And in the end, he chose preservation over illusion. I closed the envelope and set it aside. Those letters were not mine to deliver. His confrontation belonged to her. His grief belonged to him. And I would not become the messenger of guilt she had earned on her own. Later that week, I saw Thomas. "Will you give them to her?" he asked. "No," I said. "She already knows. These wouldn't help her. They would only burden me." He nodded. He understood. Some truths are not meant to be reconciled. Some truths are meant to remain written, not spoken. Months passed. The lawsuit faded. My parents disappeared from headlines. Their story ended in court. Mine did not. One evening, at a legal conference, I crossed paths with Judge Brennan. He approached without robe, without formality, just a man who had witnessed legacy confront blood. "Haley," he greeted, "you carry him well. Did he ever speak to you about Diane?" I asked. He exhaled. "Often. He loved her. He didn't like her. There's a difference. He worried he had failed her. But he never doubted you." I thought about that. How a man can question the child he raised by blood, yet trust entirely the one he raised by presence. How legacy chooses its heir. That night, I sat at my desk and drafted my own will. I was 33, too young, people would say, but I had learned early that legal clarity is the final form of love. I left nothing to Diane or Scott. Not out of malice, just refusal to enable. Instead, I created scholarships, legal aid funds, endowments for children raised without parents, but not without guardians. I also wrote a letter. Inheritance is not money, it is memory. I leave behind what was left to me. Consistency. Principle. Presence. I signed it. Folded it. Placed it in a drawer. As he did. The world believes justice is found in verdicts. It isn't. Justice is found in documentation. Verdicts only reveal what was already written. I thought the courtroom was my ending. I was wrong. It was my beginning. Whatever people assumed about inheritance, they believed the fight ended with the verdict. They didn't understand that the lawsuit was never the real war. It was only the burial of illusion. What came next was legacy. The call came on an ordinary morning. No warning, no ceremony. My assistant appeared at my office door with a note in her hand and a look I hadn't seen since the trial. "It's the governor's office," she said. They weren't calling for prosecution. They were calling for appointment. "Ms. Morrison," the voice on the line began. Formal yet warm. "We would like to offer you a judgeship at the state level. Your record is exemplary. Your integrity has been noted." And then, almost quietly, "Your grandfather's name still echoes here. It appears yours now does as well." I said nothing at first. I could see him in my mind, my grandfather, seated at the dining room table. Robe draped on the chair. Teaching me how to anticipate arguments 3 moves ahead. He never once said I should follow him. He simply behaved in a way that made me understand what justice looked like when practiced rather than preached. "I accept," I said. Confirmation hearings were scheduled. I prepared for legal scrutiny. Case reviews. Public examination of rulings. Instead, I was questioned about my family. One committee member leaned forward. Glasses low. Voice speculative. "Ms. Morrison, you were involved in litigation with your biological parents regarding your grandfather's estate. Some may question whether this reflects a strain in personal character, specifically in your capacity for family loyalty. How do you respond?" I didn't hesitate. "Family loyalty," I said calmly, "is not a matter of blood. It is a matter of presence. My grandparents demonstrated loyalty by raising a child who was not their responsibility. They showed up, daily, quietly, without condition. The individuals who sued me were absent for decades and returned only for inheritance. Loyalty without consistency is not loyalty. It is convenience." Silence followed. Then someone, unplanned, applauded. I was confirmed. Judge Haley Morrison. My first day on the bench. I unlocked chambers that once belonged to him. My grandfather. I found no portraits, no relics, only a desk, a window overlooking the city, and a single empty chair. I sat and felt, not pressure, but gravity. My first case was a custody hearing. Two parents battling for a child they had both neglected until the court became their stage. They raised their voices, accused one another, used the child's name like a weapon. I listened, and then I ruled. This court is not interested in who claims love. It is interested in who practices it. Parental rights are not protected by biology. They are protected by presence. This child will not be raised by ego. She will be raised by consistency. Word began to spread. There was a new judge on the bench, one who punished absence. Who rewarded sacrifice. Who made rulings that stung because they were not softened by sentiment. I wasn't cruel. I was precise. There is a difference. Years turned. I moved from trial court to appellate. From appellate to state Supreme Court. Justice Haley Morrison. I wrote opinions that were cited across the country. Cases involving guardianship, elder care, estate disputes, and in each one, the same principle appeared, not as emotion, but as doctrine. Blood is evidence of origin, not evidence of duty. They called it controversial. I called it accurate. One opinion shifted the judicial landscape. A father, absent for 15 years, returned to claim custody of a child raised by a neighbor. Legally, he was the parent. Practically, he was a stranger. I wrote, to appear when a child succeeds is not parenting. To remain when a child struggles is. The court recognizes not the claims of biology, but the labor of presence. It became known, informally, as the Morrison Standard. Some said it was personal. They were correct. I only write law I am willing to live by. Then came the news. Diane had died. Scott sent a brief email. No apology, no last words, just a document-sized announcement, she passed. Thought you should know. I did not respond. I did not attend. I did not mourn. People asked if I regretted it. I answered plainly, you cannot grieve what you were never given. Later, a young clerk asked me, timidly, do you ever wish things were different? I told her the truth. No, I only wish they were honest sooner. Because honesty is the only form of closure I have ever believed in. I did not retire because I was tired. I retired because the work was complete. People assume resignation arrives when strength runs out. In truth, it arrives when purpose has been fulfilled. I had sat on the state Supreme Court for years, written opinions that reshaped how families were defined, how inheritances were protected, how loyalty was measured. I had ruled in cases that mirrored my own life. Though I never spoke that aloud. The world saw doctrine. I saw echoes. My final opinion was deliberate. A comprehensive ruling on the nature of family in the law. I wrote, family is not defined by those who share our origin, but by those who share our burdens. Blood may claim inheritance. Only presence may earn it. It was quoted, criticized, praised, saved. I did not respond to any of it. My name was already set in stone. But name was never what I sought. Legacy was. On the day I announced my retirement, a reporter asked if I had any regrets. No, I said, I did not choose my beginnings, but I chose my continuance. That is enough. In the months that followed, invitations came, lectures, interviews, honorary titles, but I declined them all. I didn't want to be studied. I wanted to be quiet. Silence had been my first language. It seemed right it should also be my last. Then came an invitation I could not ignore. The state was renaming the Supreme Court building. The William Parker Justice Center. My grandfather. They asked me to speak at the dedication. I arrived early. The halls were still draped in cloth, waiting to be unveiled. His portrait hung inside, robe, gavel. The same gaze I knew at Sunday dinners, the gaze of a man who could hear a lie before it was spoken. When the ceremony began, I stepped to the podium. I did not bring notes. Justice William Parker. I began, served 40 years on the bench. But his greatest judgment was not written. It was lived. He raised a child who was not his responsibility. He showed up when it cost him time, money, rest. He chose action over biology. And he taught me that presence, when consistent, becomes law. I let the silence carry him. He was not my blood. I continued. And yet he is the reason I stand here. Heritage is not who brings you into this world. Heritage is who shows you how to live in it. I stepped away. There was applause. But I wasn't listening to them. I was listening for him. That evening, I returned to the cemetery. The tulips were blooming again, stubborn, perennial, uninvited yet unstoppable. I knelt once more before the stone. We finished it, I said. Everything you started. I placed my hand against the ground. Against all that remained of the people who gave me everything and expected nothing. I felt no sorrow, only permanence. Because love, when lived with discipline, does not die. It transfers. I stood. I left. I did not look back. Years passed. No one knew where I went. I traveled. I read. I lived without litigation. I never married, never sought children. I had already been parented. That, for me, was enough. Before I left my house for the last time, I opened the drawer where I kept 2 letters, his and mine. I read his one last time. You owe them nothing. You owe the truth everything. I folded it. I placed it back. And I whispered, I did. Because in the end, I was never avenging anything. I was preserving it. I was never punishing blood. I was honoring presence. I was never seeking justice. I was continuing it. I am Haley Morrison. I was raised by William and Helen Parker. They were not my biological parents. They were my inheritance. And inheritance, real inheritance, is not money. It is memory. It is principle. It is presence. And presence always outlives blood. If this story unsettled you, it means you still believe silence is harmless. Stay, if you dare. Justice isn't always loud.